Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11. Today, we're going to be talking about degrowth and really within this idea around transnational alternatives to capitalism. Degrowth, it's linked to what we saw last week, the idea of buen vivir and the good living. And it's also linked to ecosocialism or eco-socialist positions around finding alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. Before we start, I want to frame this degrowth debate, and remember, I'm looking at this degrowth debate from a transnational perspective, and I wanna frame it through Chris Edge's idea of capitalist illusion, and how the degrowth discourse it's installed, and it should be framed around challenging that illusion. In that sense, again, I'm looking at degrowth, obviously from an economic perspective, but it's more of a discursive, an economic discourse and especially since my expertise relies on this discursive analysis and looking at different political and cultural discourses, I will be focusing on that. And I think Chris Edges offers us the perfect preamble to start thinking about degrowth, and especially at by midway of this presentation, critiquing some of the degrowth discourses too. So not just accepting the degrowth paradigm. So let's hear a little bit of what Chris Edges had to say, and then I'll set up the degrowth discourse.
40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts. And that becomes a business opportunity for Shell that's up there dropping $500 million drill bits down into the Arctic Sea. It's insane. When societies reach the kind of end stage, the language they use to describe their own economic and political and social and cultural reality bears no resemblance to that reality, which is where we are. The language of free market, laissez-faire capitalism is what they feed business students and the wider public, but it is an ideology that bears absolutely no resemblance to the reality, and that gets back to the fact that of living in a kind of culture warped by pervasive illusion and self-delusion. Totalitarian societies by their nature are hyper-masculine cultures and seek to banish empathy. They not only ignore the vulnerable and the weak, but they ridicule them and persecute them. They celebrate supposed values of force, strength, violence, and empathy is seen as weakness. I mean, in a free market society, all of those companies like Goldman Sachs would have gone into bankruptcy. But we don't live in a so-called free market. We live in a kind of bizarre species of corporate socialism. So in the end process of decayed states, you have forces in essence cannibalizing the state itself, which is where we are. I mean, a poor person of color on the streets of Camden, New Jersey are worth nothing to the state. Put them behind bars, they're worth $40,000 or $50,000 a year to prison contractors and food service companies and phone card companies. And that is something that is very real, but often not even understood by the victims themselves.
Right. So remembering there that illusion, one of the illusion will be the illusion of freedom, and how freedom is framed within this corporate socialism, as Chris Edges call it, or even totalitarian capitalism, and he also calls it. But also the idea of empathy and caring. And remember that this links back to what we were talking about with the idea of the good living, right? And also do not forget some of the criticism of that good living and the localization. And remember the context-based necessity that it comes when theorizing good living. So in that sense, degrowth is a counter narrative to that hegemonic illusion of market freedom, right? And here, Dorothea Lena Shopek and her article on is it really degrowth, on questioning or analyzing degrowth as a revolutionary counter movement. And here, when we're thinking about revolutionary, we have to think of revolutionary in terms of like going to the root, a discourse that goes to the root and attacks that root idea and ideology, therefore is able to counter the hegemony of economic freedom, right? So it's worth quoting Shapek in full, and I'll be commenting this quote in a bit. So this degrowth counter within this degrowth counter hegemonic potential, it is relatively straightforward to characterize the discursive field as an alternative economic imaginary. So that is, degrowth is an alternative economic imaginary, an alternative to that framing of economic freedom as the only freedom. This degrowth discourse, right, this alternative economic imaginary of degrowth distinguishes itself from the hegemonic neoliberal discourse through an alternative crisis interpretation. So it's reading the crisis from a different angle, from an alternative to growth. And in that debate that I'll analyze a little bit between Jason Hickel, Frank Hauser, you can see how it's this alternative interpretation to the growth paradigm, whether it's green growth or traditional dystopian capitalist growth. Because at this point, really, I don't think anyone in his or her right mind can basically think of the status quo of capitalist growth as we knew it, or as we know it until now, as basically anything but dystopian. If we pay attention to the science, right? So the following basic consensus is shared by all degrowth strands. Economic growth and the destruction of human livelihoods cannot be decoupled. So then that is the decoupling from GDP, gross domestic product, and carbon emissions. So those two things cannot be decoupled. And basically what green growth argues is that you can actually decouple through technology and some type of regulation. You can decouple the carbon emissions emitted by the different global industries, and the gross domestic product. So you can actually keep growing while you reduce emission, and that is called decoupling, right? And what degrowth theory points at is that it is in fact technically impossible to do that, and as backed up by what we've done so far, right? So basically it's a question of speed. The reduction had to be so fast that is technically impossible, unless you believe in miracle. That's the degrowth position, right? So the second one is transformation of Western industrial. And here, Western industrial, it has to be emphasized, right? Societies is necessary. So by Western here, I will be referring to the North, to the global North, and by non-Western peripheries, societies, I'll be referring in as the global South. Okay. The third one, sustainable growth development, is insufficient. So basically, green growth is just not enough, right? And this transformation, degrowth, has to be moderated through democratic and solidarity processes in order to find an alternative that serves the well-being of everyone. Yeah. So it has to be democratized. And basically, the bottom line here is the economy has to be democratized. So at least at the level of politics. Yeah. So if we think of the political of governments and political processes and how democracy plays a role, So we need to have at least the same level of democratic process in politics as is in economics. Yeah. So, and finally, this appeal cannot be just an appeal to individual changes of lifestyles. It has to emphasize the collective, but also the global, and both North and South. So then the question that we need to start asking is really degrowth a revolutionary alternative? Is even degrowth an alternative? I would argue that yes, it is an alternative. Now we need to question if it's really a revolutionary alternative. And the answer to that, especially if you read Skopek's article, is that yes, but, right? From a transnational discursive perspective, that is from the viewpoint of challenging the global discourse of economic freedom as the only paradigm, as the only game in town, right, is a very effective provocation. It provokes a very useful reaction to this growth paradigm because it immediately questions the idea of growth. And that is very unique when it comes to ecological politics. And so that's why Shopek calls it a potentially action guiding, right? Action guiding. And that's very important to think about. It's a discourse that could guide political action. But it's an imaginary that is not yet institutionalized. So it relies on social movements pretty much to effect this type of, or to guide this type of political action, and it's not being taken up by any institutions. And institutions here, we're talking about transnational institutions, so not just governments, but global institutions such as the United Nations, for instance, or the European Union. Yeah, so not just only governments. Now, it's really important because what is really doing degrowth, or what is doing very effectively, that is really challenges this paradigm of no alternatives, is actually looking at what it was basically the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's infamous conceptualization of the end of history after the Berlin Wall. Basically, there is no alternative but liberal democracy within a capitalist paradigm. It is challenging that alternative and saying, actually, it's not that there are alternatives, it's that we must find an alternative that does not rely on any of the major principles of that paradigm, and especially it does not rely on the growth paradigm, with an emphasis on the growth paradigm, which is what basically carries forward neoliberal economics. In that way, it can reconceptualize the idea of freedom. This idea that the idea of freedom within neoliberalism, by which economic freedom is the prerequisite for individual liberty, which this individual liberty is the base for political freedom. And in here, that is the base of liberal democracies, liberalism. So basically, in neoliberalism, you couple economic freedom with political freedom and individual freedom. Those three are at the same level, right? And what the degrowth paradigm is saying is basically decoupling, ironically enough, decoupling economic freedom from political freedom. Say basically economic freedom has nothing to do with political freedom, and it certainly has nothing to do with individual freedom in a context of ecological crisis. And it's showing how precisely that tandem is the cause of the ecological crisis. It's creating a discourse by which look at that tandem and look at the consequences, and what you have is the current climate crisis, right? And I really like this. If you go back to week 9, I really like that the idea that Matthew Desmond in Poverty by America entertained, that is precisely this question of framing the interpretation of freedom, of the interpretation of reframing, and reinterpreting neoliberalism and what to do, right? Because the idea of freedom here, freedom of choice, will be tantamount when thinking about a building on fire and having the freedom to either remain in place or jump out of the window, right? As Matthew Desmond pointed out when it comes to poverty. And the question is not to choose between remaining in place and jumping out. The question is precisely to think completely differently, in completely different terms. And so in that way, I think the only game in town today is really green growth versus degrowth. I think that work is already being done. So that would be the background of the debate that Jason Hickel and Frank Hauser have around green growth and degrowth. And to me, the real question after looking at the debate is really what kind of degrowth. Not so much, I think, and if you really follow the debate and then read the politics behind green growth, to me it's hard. I'm just not convinced, not very much convinced by green growth, and I think basically politics, especially politics, will back up my non-convincing, because the reduction has to be so great that thinking that doing a version of the same thing, a version of capitalist growth, will get you there, is, to say the least, unconvincing. To say the least, unconvincing, or at best, unconvincing. So now from that framework, from the framework of green growth being basically a version of capitalist growth, a more feasible or less destructive version of capitalist growth, but destructive nonetheless, then degrowth arises as a possible alternative, right? And then the thinking here is, what kind of degrowth? Especially when we're thinking about degrowth, we need to think in transnational terms. So from nation to nation and at a global level. And here, in transnational terms, I will be thinking in terms of the global north versus the global south, the nations in the global north versus the nations in the global south, and the dialogue that needs to happen. And one kind of degrowth that is not feasible is that self-sufficient degrowth, which basically focus on a neo-Malthusian conservation agenda that you can see in the other article that is assigned in Bravo Moriano's when it comes to Ecuador, and that this neo-Malthusian conservation agenda basically states that the population growth and the scarcity that comes with it requires that we retreat, that we humanity retreat. And what that means is basically when we need to reduce the population. Therefore, Malthus, right? This neo-Malthusian. We need to reduce the population. They don't put it very just like that, but basically these theories talk in terms of human impact. Therefore, conservation agendas, we need to conserve the biosphere, and the idea of bracketing parts of the world where humanity cannot set foot. In that way, that's how you retreat, right? That's how you stop having an impact on the biosphere. And create degrowth. So it's this idea of retreating back to nature. It's a version of retreating back to nature, and consequently, and in between the lines, reducing the population. The consequence of that will be reducing the population, right? And having measures to reduce the population, which is far from ethical, I will put it, but let's put it like that. But at the same time, we need to ask, okay, so if you're gonna bracket those areas, this biosphere, who are you displacing? No, and in the question in Ecuador, it's a good example of that. When you bracket that, who are you displacing? Because in those areas, there's people living in those areas. It's not the case that these areas are basically empty of people. If that was the case, then there's nothing to conserve, right? The point is that whose good living is at stake here, yeah. And the answer to that is usually indigenous poor people, indigenous peasants, working class people, poor people in general, right? So in that sense, that is not the kind of degrowth that seems to be the most effective and basically it's just unethical. Yeah. So then the degrowth that is proposed by Jason Hickel, to me, seems to be much harder to be co-opted by, what Schopenhauer called, following Gramsci, neoliberalism's passive agenda. The idea of basically you can co-opt all these revolutionary ideas, green ideas, into basically, in order to keep doing what you were doing before. So the idea of green growth is a good example of that, right? So I think Jason Hickel's degrowth approach seems to be going in the right direction, right? And in the end, the main criticism that Frank Hauser has in that debate has to do with the political impossibility, how unfeasible it is, the degrowth movement, and how much more feasible is to have a green growth approach to political reform. But I think that is basically a trap in and of itself, right? But I just want to, because I think it's important to showcase what I think is the crux of the debate between Frank Hauser and Hickel. So let's just have a look at that, and I'll say a few things, and then I'll get into basically some of the criticisms, or not so much criticism, but some of the aspects that when we think about the degrowth movement, one should always keep in mind.
2020. Right now, there's no country, not even Sweden, that's on track for 1.5 degrees with a minimal conception of equity. So in terms of speed, we're failing, and that's the reality. And that's before you account for claims about negative emissions technology, et cetera, which the UK government does rely on.
And can I ask Sam a question building on that? So the data that Jason's citing is saying that there's no country in the world that has the rate of just carbon emissions reduction that's required for 1.5, for example. And yet the framing of green growth is very strong and very prominent, and the World Bank and the IMF and all the governments, it's spoken as if it's already a thing. But I think the argument here is it's not yet existing on the scale that's required to justify its name. So what gives people the confidence that it will be achieved in the future if there's no evidence yet that it's achievable on the speed and scale that's required, not just on carbon emissions, but on material footprints?
I mean, the sort of the cost of the decarbonisation path we are going through will be an empirical question. We'll find out just how costly it is. But there's climate change is, for me, as I said, one of the problems we can solve within the the sort of the growth paradigm, because there are nations that are decarbonizing, or not, they're decoupling their emissions from their GDP. There are issues related to consumption emissions versus production emissions, but we can see see emissions coming down. We can also see they're coming down too slowly. We can agree on that, but we can also see the path. We can see the technology.
So just to pause for a moment and here, the point is that they're coming down too slowly. The emissions are coming down too slowly. And for emissions to come down fast enough, technology basically, it's a reliance on future technologies. How it will happen. So in that sense, Frank Hauser basically argues, well, empirically, still we don't know, but it's feasible within those models, within that technology. The problem is the technology is still not here. This is the crux. So then he gets into the political will part, and I'll let him finish this.
The investments, the possibilities that would accelerate that speed. We understand what we have to do. We understand what we can do to the car fleet to turn it over. We can understand how we can electrify the economy and then use that clean electricity to clean up other sectors of the economy. Those are all sort of scenarios that have been modeled and stress tested, and the thing that's holding them back actually isn't the technology or the behavioral unwillingness, it's the political will. And it is that political will we have to work on technologically. There's a good line of one of the people who sort of study these things very thoroughly, Adair Turner, the first chair of the Climate Change Committee, who sort of has that flippant remark that sort of says, if you make me dictator of the world, I will solve the problem for you because I have my blueprint, I know exactly what I have to do. Of course, you shouldn't make anybody dictator of the world, but what he means by that is that it is a question of political dynamics as opposed to technological discovery.
I just want to pause here for a moment because this should remind you of the discussion that we had about technocratic solutions to political problems. And this is what is underlined here. It's a matter of technical solutions. It's just a matter of, if I was dictator of the world, I could solve this easily. So I think we should be aware of that type of arguments. One, because it's simply not true. It's future technologies that are still not here that you can have them model on, but for instance, rely on heavily extracting materials from the global south. That is basically further imposing more poverty on the global south and maintaining the neocolonial structures whereby the global south gives you the material resources, the global north extract them and benefit from that. So it requires that type of structure, and that type of structure is very pernicious structure. So let's finish with Jason Hinkle here.
Do you want to respond to that on the technological possibilities, whether it's on carbon emissions or on other ecological impacts?
So I was at pains in my talk to point out the various measures that green growth scenarios modeled by the IPCC rely on to accomplish green growth, right? And the truth is there's an emerging scientific consensus against many of these core assumptions, which I outlined, right? We simply can't rely on negative emissions technologies to that extent. We can't justly suppress energy use in the global south, et cetera, et cetera. We need a feasible conception of technological change and efficiency improvements. There's an amazing paper published by some colleagues of mine in Nature recently on 1.5 degrees and how if we assume more reasonable rates of technological change, which are more in line with what we understand empirically to be feasible, then something like a dramatic reduction in energy use in rich countries is required. And then the question becomes, who suffers that energy use reduction? I mean, if that's necessary, then who's that imposed on, right? Under our existing arrangement, it will be and already is being imposed on poor people, on the working classes, right? We see that here in the UK, we see that in France, and that's not acceptable. We have to fight against that. We want to get rid of other forms of energy, specifically related to forms of production that are just not necessary or organized primarily around capital accumulation, right? I mean, it's madness to be devoting energy to producing SUVs in the middle of a climate emergency. Now, the thing is, you talk about political will. The thing is that we know there's strong majority consensus around what needs to be done and how to achieve it. So in a real democracy, that would happen. If we had a democratic economy, we would not be in this situation, almost guaranteed. So who blocks it? The concern is that even many of the policies that green growthers call for, such as very high carbon taxes and so on, those are also blocked. By who? By people who would lose out in such a situation, because it makes growth more difficult to achieve. It makes capital accumulation more difficult to achieve, right? And so when we think about this question of political will, I think the question is, whose will do we need to shift here, right?
So whose will we need to shift? So it's not a question of having the political consensus. I think, I think, and when looking at polls and statistics, especially when the right questions are asked, because obviously, it really depends on how you frame the question. If you go and frame the question of, in terms of, would you sacrifice your job to save the country, for your children, basically, obviously, and logically, people, a version of that, at least, are gonna say no. But there is a great consensus that something radical needs to be done in order to stop, to revert climate change, or I think more accurate, the climate crisis that we're living in. So it's a question of willing political, wielding, it's the right word here, wielding political power, from the strong political will that it's already in place against those who benefit from the status quo. And those who benefit from the status quo are just a few, basically. Just a few companies, a few people in the global north, essentially, right? And here we need to think also in terms, and this is what is key, in terms of not only nationally, we have to think of how these policies of energy reduction, basically in the end, cost of living measures, and they target the poor, basically, already. It really burdens the poor. So again, these decisions of, it's either your job or the planet, right? It's the poor or the working class. Sometimes it's not just the poor is too vague of a concept, but the working class and the poor, the working poor, which is a new category of our times. So we need to have, in order to solve that puzzle nationally, we need to have a class-based perspective. And here, a Marxist perspective is helpful. In order to analyze value and labor, a Marxist perspective is very useful. But also we need to have a decolonial perspective and start thinking in terms of the global south and global north. And for that, I think Max Edgel's and his critique of degrowth is very useful. And he comes from an eco-socialist perspective and precisely thinking of the dynamic between the global south and the global north, and thinking in terms of the responsibility of the global north to the global south. And when I'm thinking of the global south, I'm also thinking, of India, well, not just I think these thinkers, actually, I'm thinking through these thinkers of China, India, Pakistan, and other countries in Latin America, Africa, right? So we need to reckon with that. Humanity needs to reckon with, when it comes to geopolitics, to what extent these geopolitical confrontations are artificially created or not so much created, because there is obviously a geopolitics, but at least exaggerated in order not to pay attention, or not in order to, because there is no causality, but at least there is a correlation. You have an artificial, what I would think is an artificial exaggeration of the global tensions that correlates a lack of emphasis on the ecological crisis, and therefore it doesn't allow for a proper diagnosis by which degrowth can be reframed from a decolonial perspective. And this is what Max Agels is doing, is basically kind of getting past geopolitics and looking at a critique of degrowth from a decolonial perspective and from an eco-socialist perspective. So let's hear Max Agel and some of his interventions, because I think, and he's in Denmark here, talking from Denmark, because I think it's very telling and useful to hear this critique or reframing of degrowth.
Equal per capita access to energy. This is very important, because if you actually look at the technocratic proposals that are like, sure, we can do full renewables, no problem. You actually look at it and they're like, okay, we're going to give about 10 megawatts a year to Haiti because they're more or less used to it, and we're going to maintain the same amount and with some efficiency improvements for the United States, right? So baked into it is actually like deeply racist assumptions about the acceptability of different levels of per capita access to something like energy. The last thing is equal labor distribution on a world scale. That is, if a certain amount of labor is necessary in a place like Bangladesh or Haiti or Syria in order to reproduce the things people need, then people should have to work about as hard in places like Denmark and the United States. Probably that means a little bit more hard work. It's not very clear, no one's mapped it out properly, but it needs to be said explicitly, right? I mean, that's just like, I see no feasible future where machines are just able to do everything for us. Like, I just don't see that on the table, and also resolving global warming, and also not turning the whole planet into an open air mine. Like, I think this is a completely unserious proposal.
Because we need to think, here is the key, right? Who's doing the physical labor to make all these products that are consumed globally, and especially in the global north? Who's doing it? How much physical labor is getting? How much value are we, and it's the royal we, economics is putting, how much value is putting into that physical labor? The answer to that is very, very little. So then what does it take to revert that? It's either, there is only two possible answers to that. If we actually put the real value of that physical, if we put the real price on that physical labor that is done, our products prices will shoot up, right? Will rise so much that will be unaffordable. Then the second choice is that we stop consuming that volume of products, that we reduce our consumption. And there are a bunch of if you actually watch this and Max Agel's entire intervention, he goes into some solution, and some of the solutions, for instance, has to do with the right to repair. So it's not so it's really not pie in the sky. The problem that we are having today with consumption is not so much that we consume a lot or that we won't consume a lot. That's certainly a problem. That the problem also is that this consumption is planned through planned obsolescence. Gadgets are set consciously to fail after a couple of years, and we could have laws that require companies to have gadgets that do not break at least for 10 years, because that's technologically possible. You can have a phone that lasts for 10 years, And if it breaks, you must have the right to repair without you costing you so much that it's easier to buy a new phone or a new laptop or a new whatever, or a new shirt or new jeans or whatever you want, right? So baked in this idea is basically the question of where is here? Where are we putting the here, the localized action? Where does it go to? Because capitalism is really fragmentary, and it relies on that fragmentation, of that inequality between North and South in the labor relationships, in order to keep the cycle of exploitation, and in order to keep the growth, the capitalist growth, right? So that's why green growth is very problematic, because this fragmentation, unequal fragmentation of the capitalist system is required to be in place for green growth to take place. Because again, you need to mine all these materials to make the batteries for electric cars, to electrify your grid. You need a bunch of natural resources that are mostly in the global South. Yeah. So the real thorny question is, how do we convince workers in the North to rebel against their own material interests? That is, low prices on the commodities that we consume in the North, in order to support those workers in the South, you know, and or in the name of solving the ecological crisis, right? So this is the question that makes Agil's analysis. So I'm just going to play a little bit of him, because I think it's he put it brilliantly, basically.
And many other figures across the entire South, basically are pointing out that development is actually inherently polarized, and it appears very differently in the North and in the South, that it just does not look the same. That whereas in the North, you, in a general way, have a pattern of production based on producing capital goods, and the market for wage goods is domestic, so that you kind of have an internal relationship between production and consumption, and that the working class is effectively in some way woven in, is exploited, but is also woven in politically, socially, economically into the social compact, because it gains a share of productivity increases even while still being exploited, right? That is the model of capitalism in the core states, right? And it's a model. They don't all look exactly the same, but schematically, this is very roughly correct. Periphery is very different.
Just let me explain that first, because it could be lost in basically the Marxist lingo that he's using. Basically, what he's saying is the worker in the North is baked into the capitalist system of production, and i.e., the capitalist system of production in the North needs the worker in the North to make enough, as exploited as this worker could be in the North, right, schematically in this model, in order to consume enough cheap products to keep the cycle of exploitation from the North to the South going. And then he goes, how different the same model of growth, of capitalist growth, works in the South. And for this model to work, you need to have this unequal fragmentation.
Permanent and large-scale unemployment in the periphery of the world system. Agriculture is much more oriented, relatively speaking, towards export, especially of tropical crops that cannot be grown in the North. There are large-scale labor reservoirs, right? And the entire productive structure is structured around maintaining wages low in the periphery versus in the core. And the wages are kept low in order to keep prices low, so that both commodities but also industrial products can be supplied to the North which is part of how the northern working class becomes woven into the process of accumulation on a world scale. And this is why you've seen, relatively speaking, less radical, revolutionary, anti-systemic dissent in the North versus in the South.
Right, so this is what is called South to North value transfer. Yeah, basically, commodities in the North are cheap because the physical labor is out, and the physical labor and the extraction of material, the physical labor to extract the raw materials required to make these commodities is outsourced to the South, in where the capitalist system of production in the South works by having swaths of people who are unemployed, therefore available to work for very low wages, and who do not consume and cannot consume those products that are then shipped to the North. And when I say products, I'm not only talking about gadgets, I'm talking about food and wheat and all different type of produce that goes, cattle that goes from South to North. Yeah. So this is a process of upkeeping the global capitalist production system cycle of dispossession, which is historically based on colonialism, right? We could not understand this cycle of dispossession without colonialism. And colonialism happened in the 19th century, basically, right? 19th century throughout the 20th century. So it's not, remote, and it's not 10,000s of years ago. It just, in terms of, in historical terms, it happens yesterday, basically. So, and a good example is the cobalt and the miners in Congo, and what it takes to make phones, right? To make the phones that we all have. And if I play the first 20 seconds, and then we keep this in mind, then the only answer is this system needs to be radically changed. It's simply not acceptable that this is happening, because for we to have this computer that I'm having right now, the phone that we have, all the electronics that we have, cobalt is needed under these conditions.
This is what the world's soaring demand for cobalt is doing to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Under each of these shelters are deep tunnels dug by hand. They often collapse. At the end of them are deposits of cobalt, of which Congo exported nearly $2 billion worth in 2019, and exports are growing fast. But the miners say they're being cheated.
We're working very hard and digging very far to take this out, but we're getting almost nothing for it. The conditions are dangerous, but we're not paid for our level of sacrifice under the ground.
And the sacrifices are great.
The miners working here say when they enter the shaft, it takes them 1.5 hours to climb all the way down and then through the narrow tunnels to reach the rock face where they're cutting out the cobalt. End of their shift, it takes them even longer to climb all the way back up, and it doesn't look safe at all. There are cracks in the sides of the earth, and it's propped up with tree branches and thin timber.
Right, so now we should be aware of this political discourse around the cost of this outsourcing and the cause of these conditions that have to do, well, these countries are completely corrupt, therefore, their economies are inefficient, and that's why this is happening. Now, if you look at historically, and Ecuador is a good example of that, most of the companies that outsource this labor are companies that from the North. So basically, that corruption is baked in the structures that allows these companies to create value from the North. Yeah, and even if we take that type of argument seriously, even though historically it doesn't really compute, precisely because you need to account for, colonial structures and how this corruption was put in the first place by these colonial interventions that are very much in place even after independence. What that did. But even if we take it at face value and take it seriously, then the question is, how do we end corruption? And that is through international regulation, because all these instructions, because the corruption that in theory could happen in Congo is very much accrued in value by the companies in the north. Therefore, the companies in the north need to be regulated in terms of from where are they accruing this value. Yeah. So in that way, either or, whether it's corruption or colonialism, we will have to do something about it. And if we do something about it, and let's say, create international regulation to eliminate this type of conditions, and we start paying workers in the South a decent salary, for instance, like the same salary like miners in Australia, the problem we have is an iPhone will cost you around $30,000, right? And if you read, because I really recommend you to read this report, it's a very easy to read report from the Institute for Social Research. That is basically the price that we have to pay. And not only it's in this report in the Institute for Social Research, but Forbes actually has an article around that. We would have to do something about Foxconn, and not only the Chinese government would have to do something about Foxconn, but Apple in the U.S. that it's kind of usually what is not talked about, has to do something about the Chinese government doing something about Foxconn. Yeah. So either way you look at it, we have to change the paradigm. With a little tweak wouldn't work, because if we do something about Foxconn in China, then the prices of the iPhone will dramatically increase. Therefore, we couldn't afford iPhones, right? And then this is just a sort of a metaphor for the different type of price increases that we'll have to face. Therefore, what we need to do is not cop the price increase, but think about alternatives to those price increases, alternative to the system that makes possible these price increases, right? And a way out of this is looking at transnational working class solidarity, and how these transnational links could be created for capitalism not to accommodate the precarious working conditions. Yeah. So basically, beyond the idea of the global north compensating the south, we in the north, or social movements in the north, and the degrowth movement in the north is in a pickle, because in the end, when talking about working class solidarity, we cannot simply talk about this working class solidarity on paper or in theory or in words. We have to talk about it in terms of action, right? If we have a decolonial perspective, we need to acknowledge the cycle of colonial dispossession in the South, and how, while exploitation in the North is accommodated within capitalism to the point that workers in the North can live, or basically their exploitation is baked in that system, in that fragment of the unequal cycle of dispossession within capitalism. In the South, they cannot be accommodated. They're basically eviscerated, right, little by little, through what we saw in Congo, through the expansion of indecent working conditions, of unimaginable and dangerous working conditions. So with that in mind, we need to think about degrowth political problem. How does the degrowth political problem face this reality? And historically, how the working class movement, along with the degrowth movement, can face that reality. And I think Max Edels is very useful here. And with this, we'll finish off posing this question, because obviously these questions cannot be finite. We cannot just give an answer. The idea of this question is that create a necessary discussion for different movements to find transnational network from north to north, south to south, but especially south to north, north to south. So Edels' reflection in the end should make us think of what kind of degrowth movement we should be advocating for, and what is the history behind all these movements. And with this, we'll finish. So pay attention to this and then reflect on this along with the questions that I posed for the tutorial.
I mean, the quick answer is that we fight for them, right? The same way as we do anything. But, how we fight for them is necessarily contextual. But, that's too easy an answer, in fact, because we need to address the fact that it's not easy to fight for them, first of all. I mean, and second of all, we need to have a level of honesty about the history that we're confronting, that is the historical position of many of the trade unions. Actually, I don't know the history of the trade union movement properly here and its orientation to the foreign policy. So I will neither indict nor exculpate it. I just don't know. Someone else should probably talk about it. It would be very interesting, and I would love to learn. But we can't just, I think there's a mistake to be speaking in abstraction about the working class when it comes to things like anti-imperialism. I mean, if you look at the position of the French Communist Party and the French working classes when the French was killing 500,000 people in Algeria, the French working class basically supported that, okay. If you look right now in the United States, 52% of Americans support NATO. I mean, NATO is an instrument of imperialism and imperialist monopoly capital domination. Okay, that's a lot of working class people support NATO. Actually, I happen to think anti-war sentiment is something that can be moved on in the United States, to take an example. But I think when we just say the working class, we can enter problems by not dealing with the actual terrain of struggle that the working class is, and the history of the working class. I mean, the AFL-CIO is a major supporter of US imperialism. Are we also to support the Israeli working class, which is engaged in a colonial depredation against the Palestinian people? I do not support the Israeli working class, I'm sorry. I actually support the imposition of sanctions against them, right? Now, that's kind of naughty, and here I'm going to be very, very specific for a US context, but I think it actually points out some differences that are at the table. And this is like, I really don't want someone to think I'm being like a dickhead here. People in Matt's caucus in DSA, not Matt himself, to my knowledge, you're good, but people in your caucus, as well as people aggressively fighting for a Green New Deal in the Democratic Socialists of America, voted against either the censure or removal of their congressperson who broke the BDS picket line within the organization. Okay, so there's actually a fundamental, everyone agrees in the abstract. Who's going to be like, oh, I support colonialism and imperialism, socialist, happy to meet you. Come on. Nobody is going to say that, right? Everyone agrees on these programs in the abstract. When it gets to the concrete, they're like, Oh, but this was really complicated. We have a very specific algebraic, topological, mathematical equation to tell you why the surrender on the rights of people living under imperialist sanctions and colonization, well, we really needed to compromise on this because that's how we build a socialism that, come on, right? When you get to the concrete, that's where that's also the class.
Right, so remember what we were talking about, week 10, about the theoretical praxis. Theory has to be localized, has to be put in context, in a specific, it has to be contextualized, it has to be concrete, because everyone agrees on the answer. When we talk about the working class, what working class, in what context, where are the measures, where the specificity of that, of those measures, what does it take, what is the level of sacrifice? And I think the Ecuadorian case, if you read the article of Bravo and Moreno, it tells you, it's very telling of how the idea of good living becomes problematic, or could be problematic, within an NGO paradigm of the Green State in Ecuador, right? So again, we had to always go, it's not rejecting theory, but from the theoretical paradigm of working class, cycle dispossession, all this degrowth, all these different discourses need to be leveled down with a specific context, with the concrete. Yeah, and with that, we finish for today.